There is a secret the ancient philosophers discovered that the modern world has almost completely forgotten. Not a technique, not a method, not a morning routine, a fundamental shift in how you relate to everything outside of you. Right now, something or someone is getting to you. Maybe it happened today. Maybe it has been happening for years. A person whose words still echo. A situation that keeps pulling you back in. A world that feels relentless, unpredictable, and indifferent to what you need. The Stoics called this the central wound of human suffering. And they found the cure. Tonight, their words will show you exactly how to become unreachable. The philosophy is called Stoicism, and before you dismiss it as something distant, academic, or reserved for marble busts and university lecture halls, consider this. The three men most responsible for preserving and practicing it were an emperor who governed 50 million people, a slave who owned nothing and could be beaten at will, and a wealthy advisor who served one of history's most dangerous rulers. Three completely different lives. Three completely different circumstances, and every single one of them arrived at the same conclusion about what it means to be free and what it means to be truly untouchable. That is not a coincidence. That is evidence. Stoicism was not invented to comfort philosophers sitting comfortably in quiet rooms. It was tested in real pressure, in the kind of pressure that breaks people. It was refined in exile, in chains, in war, in betrayal, in grief. And the reason it has survived more than 2,000 years is not because it sounds good on paper. It is because it actually works, and the people who practiced it proved it under conditions most of us will never face. But to understand what they discovered, you have to go back to where it all started. Not to a palace, not to a library, to a shipwreck. Around 300 BC, a merchant named Zeno of Citium was sailing from Phoenicia to Greece with a cargo of purple dye, one of the most valuable commodities in the ancient world. The ship went down. The cargo was lost. Zeno survived, arrived in Athens with almost nothing, and wandered into a bookshop, where he picked up a volume of writings about Socrates. He later said that was the moment his real life began. He began studying philosophy, eventually walking away from the idea of rebuilding his merchant fortune, and started teaching in a public covered walkway in Athens called the Stoa Poikiale. That walkway gave the philosophy its name. The people who gathered there to learn came to be called Stoics. What Zeno taught was a radical reorientation of where human beings look for security. The dominant schools of thought at the time told you that happiness came from pleasure, or from social standing, or from wisdom accumulated through a lifetime of gentle contemplation. Zeno said something different. He said that the only true good is virtue, not wealth, not health, not status, not even comfort. Virtue, meaning the quality of your own character and the choices you make, is the only thing that cannot be taken from you by accident, by other people, by fortune, or by time. This was not a self-help slogan. It was a complete restructuring of what it means to have a good life. Zeno divided all things in the universe into two categories: things that depend on us, meaning our own judgments, desires, aversions, and responses, and things that do not depend on us, meaning the body, reputation, property, the behavior of other people, the movement of events. He called the second category externals, and he taught that attaching your sense of well-being to any external was a form of voluntary enslavement, because externals can always be taken away. The implications of that idea are enormous, and they take time to fully absorb. Because every anxiety you have ever felt, every time you lay awake worrying about what someone thinks of you, every time someone's words knocked you off balance for the rest of the day, every time a disappointment felt like it undermined your worth. Every single one of those experiences has the same root. You placed something you cannot control in the position of something you need. Zeno saw it. His successors sharpened it. And three figures in particular took it further than anyone before or since. The first was born into slavery somewhere in Hierapolis, in what is now western Turkey, around 50 C. His name was Epictetus, and his life was, from the outside, a catalogue of things that would justify despair. He was a slave. At some point, his leg was permanently damaged, almost certainly as a result of deliberate cruelty by an owner. He had no property, no family of origin he could name, no citizenship, no legal standing. Everything the ancient world considered essential to a dignified life, Epictetus was denied. And yet the only surviving record of his teaching, compiled by his student Arrian in a work called the Discourses, reads like dispatches from someone who has found the one place no one can reach. His first and most famous statement is also his most compressed. Some things are in our control, and others are not. In our control are opinion, pursuit, desire, aversion, and in a word, whatever are our own actions. Not in our control are body, reputation, command, and in one word, whatever are not our own actions. He meant this literally. Your leg can be broken, he taught. The leg is not you. Your opinion about the leg, your response to the pain, your decision about how to live despite the leg, that is you. And no one can touch that without your permission. This was not resignation. Epictetus was not telling people to accept injustice quietly. He was identifying the one dimension of existence that remains sovereign, regardless of what anyone does to you. The inner citadel, as later scholars would call it. The place inside where your true self lives, and where no external force has jurisdiction unless you invite it. The second figure arrived roughly 70 years later, and from the opposite end of the social spectrum. Marcus Aurelius was born in 121 C into a family with deep connections to the Roman imperial court. He was adopted by Emperor Antoninus Pius and trained for leadership from childhood. He became emperor in 161 C and ruled for nearly 2 decades. He commanded armies. He decided the fates of provinces. He held more institutional power than almost any human being in recorded history. And in private, he wrote to himself, every night or close to it, in a journal he never intended for anyone else to read. He reminded himself of the same things Epictetus had taught. Do not be dragged along by impression. Ask of every situation whether it lies within your control. Remember that the obstacle is the path, that the impediment to action advances action, that what stands in the way becomes the way. What is remarkable about Marcus is not that he wrote these things. It is that he had to keep writing them, which means he kept forgetting them, kept getting pulled back into anxiety and anger and frustration, and kept having to return to the same foundational truths. The journal, eventually titled the Meditations, is not the record of a man who has achieved perfect peace. It is the record of a man in an endless daily battle to hold on to a clarity that the world constantly threatens to destroy. That makes it more useful, not less. The third figure was Lucius Annaeus Seneca, known simply as Seneca, born around 4 BC in what is now Spain. He was a playwright, a rhetorician, a senator, and for a time the most powerful man in Rome after the emperor himself. He served as advisor to Nero, one of history's most erratic and violent rulers, a position that required navigating constant danger with extraordinary care. Seneca wrote prolifically about Stoic practice, about anger, about the shortness of time, about the nature of friendship, about how to face death. He was eventually accused of conspiracy against Nero and ordered to take his own life in 65 C. By all accounts, he did so calmly, in the Stoic manner, dictating final thoughts to his scribes while bleeding out. 3 men, a slave, an emperor, and an advisor to a tyrant. Their lives never overlapped, and yet they form a single unbroken line of inquiry into the same question: what actually has power over you? Not what feels like it has power, not what society tells you has power, not what your nervous system responds to. What actually, in the deepest structural sense, can determine the quality of your inner life without your consent? Their collective answer was the same: nothing. Nothing can do that without your cooperation. And the moment you understand exactly how cooperation works, the moment you see the precise mechanism by which external events hijack internal experience, everything changes. But here is what makes this so difficult to grasp, even for people who have read these texts many times. The Stoics were not denying that the world affects you. They were not telling you to feel nothing. They were not recommending indifference. Epictetus wept. Marcus grieved the deaths of his children. Seneca described longing and loneliness with devastating precision. The philosophy is not about becoming a stone. What it is about is identifying the invisible step, the one that happens so fast most people never notice it, between the event that occurs and the feeling that follows. Because between those two things, between the thing that happens and your response to it, there is a moment of judgment. A split-second interpretation, a choice, even if it does not feel like one. And it is inside that gap, that vanishingly small interval of human processing, where the entire Stoic project lives. Zeno saw it. Epictetus named it. Marcus practiced it daily. Seneca wrote about it in language so precise it still cuts. And if you can learn to see that gap in your own experience, something shifts. The person whose opinion used to ruin your afternoon loses a degree of their hold on you. A situation you cannot change becomes something you can navigate, rather than something that is happening to you. The feeling of being reached, of being gotten to, of being pulled off your own center by someone or something outside you, begins to loosen. Not because you stop caring, but because you finally understand exactly what you were doing that made them so powerful in the first place. So let us go deeper into that mechanism, because understanding it intellectually is one thing. Feeling it shift inside you is another entirely, and the Stoics were relentlessly practical. They did not want you to nod along, they wanted you to change something. The word they used for that invisible step, that gap between event and response, was fantasia. Roughly translated, it means impression. When something happens, the mind receives an impression of it. The sun rises, and you receive an impression of light. Someone insults you, and you receive an impression of being attacked. You lose something valuable, and you receive an impression of lack. These impressions arrive automatically, without asking your permission. That part is not under your control. But what you do with the impression, whether you accept it as true, whether you act on it, whether you let it restructure your entire inner world, that part is entirely yours. Epictetus used a specific word for this act of acceptance. Synkatathesis, assent. The idea is that every impression asks a question. Is this real? Is this as significant as it feels? Does this actually mean what it seems to mean? And you are always answering that question, whether you realize it or not. Most people answer it instantly, automatically, without examination. The impression arrives, assent is given, emotion follows, behavior follows emotion. And then they look back and wonder why they said that, why they reacted that way, why they handed over so much power to something so small. The entire Stoic training program, if you can call it that, is about slowing down that sequence, not stopping it, not suppressing emotion before it forms, slowing it down just enough to insert awareness into the gap, just enough to ask the one question that changes everything. Does this thing actually have the power over me that I am about to give it? Now here is where it gets uncomfortable, because the answer almost always is no. The person who criticized you does not have access to your worth. They have access to their own judgment about you, which is itself shaped by their history, their mood, their fears, their needs, and their blind spots. What they said tells you something about them. It tells you almost nothing certain about you. And yet, for most people, a single critical sentence from the right person at the right moment can unravel an entire day, an entire week, sometimes longer. Marcus Aurelius wrote about this with a precision that feels almost clinical. He asked himself, when upset, whether the thing disturbing him was actually a catastrophe, or whether he was simply treating an impression as though it were a fact. He reminded himself that the mind that is troubled by bad news and the mind that receives the same news calmly are both receiving the same information. The difference is not in the world. The difference is in the interpretation. And interpretation is a skill. It can be practiced. It can be improved. And in improving it, you do not become colder or more distant from life. You become more stable inside it. This is the pressure point the Stoics kept returning to, and it is worth sitting with. We live as though our emotions are the direct and inevitable result of what happens to us. If something good happens, we feel good. If something bad happens, we feel bad. This seems like common sense. It seems like simple cause and effect. But the Stoics observed something that most people spend their entire lives never noticing. Between the cause and the effect, there is always a judgment, always an interpretation. And that interpretation is not neutral. It is shaped by habit, by expectation, by what you have decided in advance that events mean. Change the judgment, and the emotional effect changes with it. Epictetus pushed this further than almost anyone dared to. He taught his students to practice what he called negative visualization, which sounds pessimistic, but is actually one of the most psychologically sophisticated tools in the Stoic arsenal. The exercise is this: before you value something, before you grow attached, spend a moment imagining its absence, not to torment yourself, but to feel, in advance, that you can survive without it, that its loss, while painful, would not end you, that your capacity for a good life does not depend on this one thing remaining. He applied this to relationships, to health, to status, to possessions, and most radically, he applied it to the opinions of other people. What would it feel like, he asked, to simply not need their approval, not to be hostile to it, not to dismiss it, but to genuinely not require it as a condition of your peace? What kind of life becomes possible when the thing other people think of you falls from the category of necessity into the category of preference? The answer, for anyone who has ever practiced this even partially, is a kind of lightness that is genuinely difficult to describe. But here is the tension. And this is the tension that makes Stoicism not a comfortable philosophy, but a demanding one. If you accept that nothing external has power over your inner life without your consent, then you also have to accept something that is much harder. That every time you have been destabilized, every time someone got to you, every time a situation pulled you out of your center and left you reactive and raw, some part of that was yours. Not because you are weak, not because you are broken, but because you gave assent to an impression that deserved to be questioned. You handed over the key. That realization is the first major turning point in this story. and it lands differently for different people. For some, it is a relief, a sudden clarity. If I am the one doing this to myself, then I am also the one who can stop. The locus of the problem moves inward, and with it moves the locus of the solution. No longer waiting for the world to become less harsh, less unpredictable, less populated with difficult people. You can begin now, with this breath, with this moment, with the very next impression that arrives. For others, the same realization produces a flash of resistance. It can feel, at first, like blame, like the philosophy is suggesting that victims of genuine cruelty are responsible for their own suffering. That is a serious misreading, and the Stoics were explicit about it. Epictetus, who was himself a victim of genuine cruelty, was not telling slaves that their bondage was their fault, or that it did not matter. He was telling them that there was one domain, one final unconquerable dimension of human existence that the master could not enter. The master could own the body. The master could not own the judgment. The master could not force the slave to consent internally to the idea that this situation defined his worth or ended his dignity. That distinction is not a consolation prize. It is a survival mechanism of the deepest order, and it is also, crucially, the same mechanism available to anyone who feels trapped by what other people think, say, or do. Which brings us to the question that has been circling since the very beginning. If the mechanism is real, if the gap between impression and assent actually exists, if the power to not be reached is genuinely available, why is it so hard? Why do people who understand this intellectually still find themselves destabilized, still find themselves handing over the key again and again, still find themselves laying awake at 3 a.m. because of something someone said at noon? The Stoics had a precise answer to that too, and it has everything to do with what they called the ruling faculty of the mind. The hegemonikon, the inner commander. Because understanding the gap and being able to use it reliably are separated by a vast distance. And crossing that distance requires something most people have never been taught, and something the modern world almost never rewards. It requires practice that feels like failure. Practice that feels like failure. That phrase needs to sit for a moment, because it is the thing almost no one tells you about this philosophy, and it is the reason so many people encounter Stoicism, feel a surge of recognition, and then quietly set it aside within a few weeks. The Stoics were not optimists about human nature. They were not telling you that this was easy or natural, or that with a little intention you would quickly find yourself unshakable. They were telling you something more demanding and ultimately more honest, that the mind, left to its own devices, is a creature of habit, and habits, especially mental habits, are not broken by understanding alone. They are broken by repetition, by catching yourself doing the thing you wanted to stop doing, and trying again, and again, and again. Marcus Aurelius failed at this constantly. The Meditations make that clear if you read them closely. He did not write, "I conquered my anger today." He wrote, "Do not let anger take hold. Reason is within reach." He wrote reminders to himself about the same failures, the same reactive impulses, the same tendency to be pulled off center by criticism or flattery, or the sheer frustration of managing people who did not think clearly. These are not the notes of a man who had arrived. They are the notes of a man perpetually in the middle of the journey who kept choosing to continue it. And that is the first revelation that changes how you understand this philosophy. It is not a destination. It is a direction. The Stoics had a term for the person who had fully embodied Stoic virtue, the sage, or sophos in Greek, the perfectly rational, perfectly virtuous individual who never gives unwarranted assent, never hands over the key, never mistakes an impression for a fact. And they also openly acknowledge that this person almost certainly did not exist. Chrysippus, one of the great early Stoic thinkers who systematized much of what Zeno began, said the sage was as rare as the phoenix, appearing perhaps once in an era, perhaps not at all. So why describe an ideal you cannot reach? Because the direction matters more than the destination. Because a person moving toward that standard, even imperfectly, even with frequent backsliding, becomes more capable of living well than a person who never aims for it at all. The Stoics were not asking you to be perfect. They were asking you to practice. Every single day, with whatever circumstances the day brought you. This is where the philosophy becomes extraordinarily practical, and where it diverges sharply from how it is often presented. The Stoic exercises were not abstract. They were daily, structured, and aimed at specific vulnerabilities in the human mind. Epictetus taught his students to begin each morning by identifying what they would encounter that day and preemptively choosing their response, not predicting the future, but rehearsing the posture. Something difficult will happen today. Someone will be rude. Something will not go according to plan. A situation I cannot control will unfold in a way I do not prefer. And my task is not to prevent that. My task is to practice the one thing I can actually control, which is how I meet it. Seneca did something similar in writing. His letters to his friend Lucilius, which survive as the letters on ethics, are a record of a man working through the philosophy in real time, applying it to specific situations, testing it against his own reactions, and sharing the results with someone who was doing the same. He wrote about the experience of being stuck in traffic in a Roman city, surrounded by noise and crowd and delay, and using that irritation as a laboratory. Small annoyances, he taught, are the training ground. If you cannot hold your center when the crowd is loud and slow, you will certainly not hold it when something genuinely catastrophic arrives. This is a revelation about scale that most people miss entirely. We tend to think of Stoicism as a philosophy for crisis, for the big moments, for grief, for illness, for professional collapse, for betrayal. And it is. But its practitioners knew that the big moments do not come with a warning, and you do not get to practice on them. What you get to practice on is Tuesday. The commute, the colleague who interrupts you, the plan that fell apart, the meal that was not what you expected, the comment that landed wrong. These are not distractions from the practice. These are the practice. Because here is the uncomfortable truth that the revelations of Stoicism keep circling back to. You are practicing something right now, whether you know it or not. Every time someone cuts you off in conversation and you stew about it for an hour, you are practicing stewing. Every time a disappointment sends you into a spiral of catastrophic thinking, you are practicing catastrophizing. Every time you rehearse a grievance in your mind, replaying it, sharpening it, you are strengthening exactly the neural pathway that will make the next grievance hit harder. The mind does not distinguish between productive rehearsal and destructive rehearsal. It simply builds what you repeat. Epictetus understood this with a clarity that borders on ruthless. He told his students that every time they gave in to anger unnecessarily, they were not just responding to one situation. They were voting for who they would be the next time. Every assent to an unexamined impression makes the next assent faster and more automatic. Every failure to insert the gap makes the gap smaller and harder to find. This is why the practice has to be daily. Not because you are trying to earn some philosophical credential, but because without daily reinforcement, the old habits simply reclaim the territory. The mind defaults to what it has done most. And most of us have spent years, sometimes decades, practicing automatic reaction. practicing the instant transfer of power to whatever impression arrives, practicing the belief, never examined, that the world outside us is the legitimate author of our inner states. Reversing that takes time, and it takes a particular kind of patience with yourself that the Stoics were careful to name. They distinguished between the progress maker, the Prokopton, someone genuinely working toward virtue, and someone who merely talked about it. Progress was the honored state, not perfection, not arrival, movement in the right direction, with honesty about how much distance remained. But now here is where something new enters the picture. Something that complicates the clean architecture of the philosophy in ways that matter enormously. Because the Stoics were not just teaching individuals how to manage their inner life. They were also teaching something about relationship, about how to be with other people. And this is where the picture gets more complex and, frankly, more interesting than a simple program of self-mastery. Epictetus taught that human beings are inherently social creatures, that we have roles, obligations, duties to others that are themselves part of living according to nature, which for the Stoics meant living according to reason. You are not just an isolated self practicing sovereign indifference. You are a son or daughter, a partner, a colleague, a citizen, and those roles carry genuine demands. The question is not whether to be in relationship. The question is how to be in relationship without losing your center. And this is where the doctrine of preferred indifference becomes essential. Because not everything that falls outside the category of virtue is irrelevant. Health, connection, success, good standing in your community, these things are not virtues in themselves, and losing them does not destroy your capacity for a good life. But they are nonetheless preferred. A Stoic will work toward them, will care about them, will mourn their loss. The key difference is that the Stoic will not stake their essential well-being on them. This sounds like a fine theoretical distinction. In practice, it is one of the hardest things in the entire philosophy to hold. Because the people you love are not indifferent to you, and what they think of you is not entirely without consequence. And the desire for their approval, for their affection, for their continued presence, does not simply dissolve because you have read Epictetus. These are not weaknesses. They are features of being human. The question the Stoics were asking is not how to stop caring. It is how to care without making that care the hinge on which your stability swings. Marcus Aurelius returned to this tension constantly. He loved his family. He grieved deeply when his children died, and many of them did. He was not a stone. But he had trained himself to place that grief in a context, to feel it without being wholly consumed by it, to let it move through him rather than becoming a permanent fixture that distorted every subsequent perception. He wrote, "When you wake in the morning, tell yourself, the people I deal with today will be meddling, ungrateful, arrogant, dishonest, jealous, and surly. But I have seen the beauty of good and the ugliness of evil, and have recognized that the wrongdoer has a nature related to my own." That passage is often quoted, but its final turn is the part that changes everything. Not, "These people are beneath me." Not, "I will rise above their pettiness," but they are related to me. Their capacity for error is my capacity for error. Their confusion is the same confusion I carry, and because of that I can meet them without contempt. This is not detachment. This is a more precise and demanding form of engagement, and it creates a complication that the initial framework of simply mastering your own impressions does not fully account for. Because what do you do when the person who keeps destabilizing you is someone you love? When the impression that arrives and demands your assent is not a stranger's rudeness, but a partner's disappointment, a parent's criticism, a friend's withdrawal, The gap between event and response does not disappear in close relationship, but the conditions under which you have to find it become infinitely more complex. And that is the complication the Stoics had to address. Not later, not in the abstract, but in the specific and daily texture of how human beings actually live together. The Stoics had a name for the web of relationships that bind human beings together. They called it oikasis, sometimes translated as affiliation, or appropriation, or belonging. The concept described the natural pull that living creatures feel toward their own kind, beginning with the self, extending outward to family, then to community, then ultimately to all of humanity. The Stoics believed this pull was not a weakness to be overcome. It was part of what it meant to live according to nature, part of what it meant to be rational. And it created a problem at the center of the philosophy that every serious practitioner eventually had to face. If you belong to others, if their well-being genuinely matters to you, then their suffering will affect you. Not because you have failed to master your impressions, but because caring is exactly what you are supposed to do. The question becomes, how far does that effect reach? How deep into your sovereign inner space does a loved one's pain have legitimate access? And what happens when someone you love is also, repeatedly, the source of your destabilization? Seneca wrestled with this more directly than either Epictetus or Marcus. His letters to Lucilius are full of the tension between philosophical clarity and human messiness. He described the experience of seeing a friend in distress and feeling that distress himself, not as a failure of Stoic discipline, but as evidence of genuine connection. He wrote about grief with unusual honesty for a philosopher of his tradition, acknowledging that the impulse to suppress it entirely was not wisdom, but performance. The Stoics, he said, distinguished between the first movements of emotion, the involuntary physiological surge that precedes conscious thought, and the sustained emotional states that follow when we give full assent to an impression and continue feeding it. The first movement is not under your control, and the Stoics did not expect it to be. Your heart rate spikes when someone shouts at you. Your eyes fill when someone you love is in pain. These are not moral failures. They are the body responding to information before the mind has processed it. What the Stoics trained was everything that came after, the story you then build around the surge, the interpretation you layer on top of it. The decision, conscious or habitual, about whether to let the impression define your state for the next hour, the next day, or the next year. This distinction changes the picture considerably, and it changes one of the most common misreadings of Stoic philosophy. Stoicism is often accused of producing emotional coldness, detachment, a kind of philosophical armor that keeps genuine feeling at a distance, and if you read certain passages in isolation, you can see why that reading exists. But set those passages alongside Seneca's letters, alongside the moments in Marcus's meditations where grief is clearly present and clearly felt, alongside Epictetus' teaching about the duties of care that relationships impose on us, and a very different portrait emerges. What the Stoics were actually describing was emotional clarity, not the absence of feeling, but the refusal to let feeling become a tyrant. The capacity to experience loss, frustration, disappointment, and love in their full reality, while retaining the one thing that makes you useful to anyone, including yourself. Your judgment, your capacity to act from reason rather than from reactive impulse. And here is where the stakes compound in a way that the initial framework did not fully anticipate. Because the people who destabilize you most reliably are almost never strangers. They are almost never the rude person in the shop or the aggressive driver on the road. Those are easy. A stranger's contempt is annoying, but it does not reach the deep places. What reaches the deep places is the person whose opinion you have decided, somewhere along the way, that you genuinely need. The parent whose approval shaped your earliest understanding of your own worth. The partner whose love has become so central to your sense of safety that their withdrawal, even temporary, feels like a threat to your foundations. The colleague or mentor whose respect you have unconsciously made into a measure of your professional identity. These are the relationships where the gap between impression and assent becomes almost impossibly difficult to find, because the impression arrives preloaded with years of history. It arrives carrying the weight of everything that relationship has meant, and inserting rational examination into that moment feels not like wisdom, but like betrayal, like you are standing back and refusing to care. Epictetus addressed this directly in a way that can feel, on first reading, almost brutal. He told a student who was distressed because his sick daughter was suffering that he had done the right thing by leaving her room to compose himself, and that this was not abandonment but practical necessity. The man who loses his center completely cannot help the person who needs him. The man who maintains enough stability to think clearly can. His composure is not a failure of love. It is love in its most functional form. This reframing is radical. It suggests that the ability to not be completely destroyed by someone else's pain is not selfishness. It is a prerequisite for being genuinely useful to them, and it extends to every form of relationship. The parent who maintains equanimity in the face of a child's crisis can guide the child through it. The one who collapses alongside the child has doubled the crisis. The leader who stays clear-headed when the situation deteriorates can find the path forward. The one who is overwhelmed is simply another obstacle in the way. Stability, in the Stoic understanding, is not a retreat from relationship. It is the foundation that makes deep relationships sustainable. But now the complication deepens further, because what the Stoics are describing requires something that cuts against one of the most powerful social norms most of us grew up inside. The norm that says your emotional reaction to someone is a measure of how much you love them. That if you can hold your center while someone is suffering or angry or disappointed, you must not really care. That being destabilized is a form of loyalty. That coming apart proves you were genuinely invested. This is one of the most destructive ideas in circulation, and it is almost never examined, because it has a kind of surface logic that feels compassionate. It masquerades as empathy, but what it actually does is create a situation where the people you love most have the most power to make you useless, where closeness becomes a direct pathway to dysfunction, where the depth of your investment in a relationship is measured by how thoroughly that relationship can override your capacity for clear thought and deliberate action. The Stoics would look at that norm and name it precisely for what it is: a confusion, a case of assenting to an impression without examining it. The impression being, if I maintain my center, I am not fully here with you, and the examination revealing, actually, my center is what allows me to be here with you in the way you actually need. Marcus understood this from the specific and exhausting position of a man who was loved and needed and scrutinized by millions, who had to make decisions every day that affected those millions, and who could not afford to be destabilized by any single voice or any single event without catastrophic consequences. He wrote about the temptation to seek approval, to want to be liked, to feel the pull of reputation as though it were something real and permanent. And he kept returning to the same corrective. Ask not what they think of you. Ask whether you are acting in accordance with reason, with justice, with your own best understanding. If yes, their opinion is irrelevant to the evaluation. If no, their opinion is still irrelevant to the evaluation, because it is your own internal judgment, not their external verdict, that needs to change. That sounds simple. It is not, because the desire for approval is not a minor preference. In evolutionary terms, social acceptance was survival. Exclusion from the group was death. The nervous system responds to social rejection with the same alarm signals it uses for physical danger. The pain of being criticized or dismissed or overlooked is not imaginary. It is neurologically real. And knowing that the response is automatic does not, on its own, dissolve it. This is the point where Stoic practice and modern psychological understanding actually converge in an interesting way. Researchers studying what is now called rejection sensitivity have found that individuals who have a strong automatic response to perceived social disapproval tend to organize significant portions of their lives around avoiding it. They make decisions based not on what they want or what is right, but on what seems least likely to generate criticism. They become, in Epictetus's precise language, enslaved to the opinions of others, not through weakness of character, but through the ordinary operation of a nervous system doing exactly what it was designed to do. The Stoic insight is not that this automatic response is wrong or shameful. It is that the automatic response does not have to be the final word. There is a layer above the automatic response where choice lives. And that layer can be trained. Not to eliminate the response, but to prevent it from automatically translating into destabilization, into the surrender of your center, into the situation the Stoics called being moved by something that was never yours to control. And here is the point where everything that has been built so far in this documentary begins to press against a harder question, one that the Stoics raised themselves and that has never been fully resolved. If the inner citadel is genuinely sovereign, if nothing external can breach it without your consent, then what happens to the person who has been so thoroughly conditioned, so early and so relentlessly, that the automatic response runs so deep it feels like identity? What happens when the gap between impression and assent is not merely hard to find, but has been, through years of experience, effectively sealed shut? When every tool you would use to examine an impression has itself been shaped by the same force you are trying to examine. The Stoics knew this was a real problem, and their answer was both more honest and more demanding than most people expect. Their answer was this: the conditioning itself is an impression, and like every impression, it can be examined. That sounds almost too simple. But sit with it, because it is the pivot on which everything else turns. When Epictetus talked about the sovereignty of the inner life, he was not describing a sovereignty that arrives fully formed at birth, waiting to be discovered. He was describing a sovereignty that is built, constructed through deliberate practice, over time, against resistance. The person who has been conditioned to automatic destabilization has not lost access to that sovereignty. They have simply not yet built the specific capacity to exercise it. And that is a completely different problem, because it has a solution. But here is where the established interpretation of Stoicism begins to strain, and where the major recontextualization happens. For centuries, the dominant reading of Stoic philosophy has framed it as a philosophy of the self. You, your impressions, your assent, your inner citadel. The individual mind, standing alone against the chaos of the world, practicing its sovereignty in solitude if necessary. This reading is not wrong, but it is incomplete in a way that matters enormously, because the three figures at the center of this story did not practice Stoicism alone, and the evidence suggests that solitary practice was never intended to be sufficient. Zeno taught in a public walkway. Epictetus ran a school. Marcus had Epictetus's discourses read to him daily, and wrote his own reflections as though in dialogue with the tradition that preceded him. Seneca engaged in sustained written conversation with Lucilius across years and many letters. The practice was always embedded in community, in dialogue, in the friction of being witnessed by others who held the same commitments. This is not a minor biographical detail. It is a structural feature of how the philosophy actually works. The gap between impression and assent, that crucial space where choice lives, does not widen automatically through individual willpower. It widens through a particular kind of attention that is extremely difficult to sustain alone, because the mind examining itself is using the same instrument it is trying to examine. There is an inherent circularity. You cannot see the shape of your own blind spots using the eyes that have the blind spots. You need, at some point, contact with a perspective that is genuinely outside your own. The Stoics called this the community of rational beings, and they considered it not supplementary to the philosophical life, but essential to it. Seneca wrote directly about this. He described the experience of being in the presence of someone who lived more wisely, even briefly, and feeling his own thinking shift in response, not through instruction, through proximity, through the contagion of a different quality of attention. This recontextualizes everything that has come before. Because if the practice is inherently relational, then the question of how to remain stable when close relationships destabilize you is not just a personal challenge. It is a paradox at the heart of the method itself. The very relationships that threaten your center are also the relationships through which your center is built and maintained. The people who can most easily reach you are also the people whose presence, when it is grounded and clear, most reliably helps you find the gap. This is why the doctrine of roles and duties, which can read like a dry ethical catalog when encountered in isolation, is actually one of the most radical elements of Stoic thought. Epictetus laid it out explicitly. Every human being occupies multiple roles simultaneously. You are a person which carries universal obligations toward all other rational beings. You are also a specific person with specific relationships, specific histories, specific debts of care and attention. And the practice of philosophy does not release you from those specific obligations. It deepens them. What changes is not your investment in the relationship. What changes is the mode of your investment. Before the practice, you invest anxiously. Needily, the relationship becomes a container for all the things you have decided your inner stability depends on. Approval, validation, continuity, certainty of being loved. After sustained practice, the investment is different. You are still fully present, still genuinely caring, but the relationship no longer carries the weight of your entire psychological architecture. It is no longer the pillar holding up the ceiling. It is something you can hold and set down and pick up again, without the whole structure collapsing. And this is where the pivot reveals something that changes the stakes of the entire conversation. If Stoic practice reduces anxious investment in relationships, it also, paradoxically, makes the practitioner capable of deeper and more genuine connection. Because when you are not using the other person to manage your own inner instability, you can actually see them. Not the version of them that threatens or validates you. Not the version that maps onto your existing patterns and expectations. The actual person, in their actual complexity, with their actual needs, which are often quite different from what your triggered nervous system was telling you they were. Marcus observed this in himself with characteristic precision. He noted that when he was reactive, when he had given full assent to an impression of being wronged or dismissed or underestimated, his perception of the other person narrowed dramatically. He saw only the aspect of them that confirmed the impression, Everything else was filtered out. But when he had caught the impression before full assent, when he had managed to stay in the gap long enough to ask whether his interpretation was the only possible one, his perception widened again. He could see the fear behind someone's aggression, the insecurity behind their boasting, the grief behind their hostility. And from that wider view, response rather than reaction became possible. He wrote about the practice of looking for the good in the people around him, not as a sentimental exercise, but as a corrective to the natural narrowing that emotional reactivity produces. It was a deliberate widening of the aperture, a refusal to let the first impression be the final verdict. Now this has a direct consequence for the question of what it means to be unreachable, because the common understanding of that phrase is defensive. Unreachable means protected, armored, sealed off. You build walls high enough that nothing and no one can get through. The Stoic understanding is almost exactly the opposite. To be unreachable in the Stoic sense is not to be defended. It is to be so fully present, so grounded in what is actually within your control, so clear about the difference between impression and fact, that the attempt to destabilize you simply finds no purchase, not because you have blocked the entry point, but because you are no longer organized around the thing the destabilizing force is trying to reach. The person who needs your approval cannot leverage it against you if you have genuinely stopped requiring it as a condition of your stability. The criticism that used to land like a weapon becomes information you can examine on its merits. The withdrawal that used to feel like abandonment becomes a behavior you can observe without immediately catastrophizing, not because you no longer care about these things, but because you have placed them accurately in the category of preferences rather than necessities. This is the mechanism, and it is extraordinarily more demanding than building walls. Building walls is passive. It requires only that you keep the world far enough away. The Stoic alternative requires active, ongoing construction of the one thing that actually determines your inner stability, your capacity to examine your own impressions in real time, under pressure, in the presence of people whose opinions trigger your deepest conditioned responses. And here is the fallout of that recognition. The fallout that creates the most pressure yet. Because if this is the path, then the moments of greatest destabilization are not your failures. They are your curriculum. The person who gets under your skin most reliably is showing you precisely where your inner work needs to go next. The relationship that triggers your most automatic and least examined responses is the relationship that is teaching you, whether you want the lesson or not, about the specific shape of your own remaining dependencies. Epictetus made this explicit in a way that his students reportedly found both illuminating and deeply uncomfortable. He told them to be grateful for difficult people, not in a performative or self-congratulatory way, but in a specifically practical way. The easy day, the smooth interaction, the situation that requires no self-examination teaches you almost nothing. It is the friction that reveals the edge of your actual capacity, and you cannot expand that edge without knowing where it is. This reframes the entire experience of being gotten to, of being reached by someone or something that you wish had not reached you. It is not a sign that you have failed the practice. It is a sign that you are inside the practice. It is the pressure that, if you do not collapse under it and do not avoid it but instead examine it, is the very thing that extends the range of what you can hold. And that understanding creates a pressure of its own, because it means there is no final arrival, no point at which the work is complete and the practice can be set aside. The world will always produce new friction, new people who find the specific nerve that still responds, new situations that locate the specific dependency you had not noticed yet. And the question is always the same. Will you treat this as an ambush, or will you treat it as the next lesson? The Stoics treated it as the next lesson. Every single time. Without exception. Not because they were indifferent to the difficulty, but because they understood something about the nature of the inner life that most people spend their whole lives not knowing. The citadel is never finished. It is always under construction, and the building materials are the very pressures you thought were trying to destroy it. The moment you accept that destabilization is curriculum, that the people who get under your skin are your most honest teachers, something immediately and uncomfortably follows. You can no longer maintain the position that your reactive state is entirely someone else's fault, not because the other person bears no responsibility for their behavior. They may bear a great deal, but the intensity of your reaction, the particular nerve that was struck, the speed and completeness with which your center was lost, that part has an address. And the address is internal. This recognition has a specific cost, and the Stoics were honest about what that cost was. The first cost is the loss of a certain kind of innocence about your own suffering. Before the philosophy, you could experience being hurt or provoked and place the full weight of explanation on what was done to you. After it, that explanation remains partly true but no longer complete. The thing done to you is real. The effect it produced is real. But you now have evidence that the effect was not purely automatic, that somewhere between the cause and the consequence, your own unexamined judgments participated. And you cannot unknow that. Marcus felt this acutely. The meditations are full of the particular discomfort of a man who has accepted responsibility for his inner states, and now must live with the discovery of how often those states are not what he wants them to be. He caught himself wanting praise, and had to examine why external praise still registered as meaningful when his philosophy told him it was not. He caught himself irritated by the same failures in the people around him, day after day, and had to confront the question of why the irritation persisted despite his repeated commitment to equanimity. He did not resolve this neatly. He returned to it, again and again, as evidence that the practice was ongoing, and the resolution was not a finish line but a direction. Seneca experienced the cost differently, and more publicly. His position as Nero's advisor placed him in a situation of extraordinary philosophical and practical tension. He wrote with great clarity about the importance of virtue, about not compromising your principles for external reward, about the shortness of time and the urgency of living well. And he was, simultaneously, one of the wealthiest men in Rome, accumulating vast property and influence through his proximity to a ruler who was becoming increasingly erratic and dangerous. His critics, both in his own time and across the centuries since, have pointed to that gap between teaching and circumstance with some force. Seneca knew about the gap. He addressed it directly in his letters. He wrote that he was not a sage. He was a progress maker, a procopt, working toward the ideal while failing to embody it completely, and that honesty about the failure was itself part of the practice. He wrote that the person who admits their distance from the ideal is closer to it than the person who claims to have arrived. Whether that argument fully closes the gap between his wealth and his teaching is a question that historians and philosophers still debate. But the argument reveals something important about the Stoic framework. It does not demand perfection as a precondition for practice. It demands honesty as a precondition for progress. The fallout from accepting this framework in your own life is that honesty becomes non-negotiable. Not honesty toward others, though that too. Honesty toward yourself. About the specific ways you are still being moved by things you have decided should not move you. About the preferences you are still treating as necessities. About the people whose opinions you have officially declared irrelevant, but whose every comment you are still privately tracking with the attention of someone who believes those opinions are actually decisive. This internal honesty is genuinely difficult. Not because people are dishonest by nature, but because the gap between our stated values and our operating values is almost always wider than we would prefer to believe. We say we do not need approval while monitoring for signs of disapproval. We say we have let something go while reviewing it in detail every night before sleep. We say we are at peace with uncertainty while arranging our lives with anxious precision to minimize the possibility of surprise. The Stoics had a name for the category of failure where you know what you should do and do not do it. They called it akrasia, weakness of will, and they were significantly more interested in its causes and mechanisms than most philosophical traditions, because they recognized it as the central practical obstacle to the life they were describing. Understanding the philosophy is one thing, acting from it under pressure is another, and the distance between those two things is where most people actually live. Epictetus returned to this point in the Discourses with an urgency that suggests he encountered it constantly in his students. He observed that people came to him having read the texts, able to quote the principles fluently, able to explain the distinction between what is in our control and what is not, and then went home and behaved in exactly the same reactive, externally driven ways they had before. They had acquired what he called the logos, the rational account of the good life, without acquiring the actual disposition to live it. And acquiring the account without the disposition, he said, is in some ways worse than having neither, because it adds a layer of self-deception. You now believe you understand something that you have only encountered as an idea. This is the first major countermove that the philosophy itself forces on its practitioners, the move from knowing to embodying. And it turns out to require something that intellectual engagement alone cannot provide. It requires exposure, deliberate, voluntary exposure to the conditions under which you fail, not seeking out suffering for its own sake, but specifically not avoiding the situations that reveal where your practice is weakest. This is what Seneca meant when he wrote about using small annoyances as a training ground. It is what Marcus meant when he said he was grateful for the people who challenged him, because they showed him where his equanimity was still a claim rather than an achievement. In practical terms, this means something quite specific and quite demanding. If someone's criticism reliably sends you into a defensive spiral, the Stoic path is not to avoid that person, or to develop a thicker skin in the conventional sense of caring less about what people think. It is to find the specific judgment you are making about the criticism that is driving the spiral, examine whether that judgment is warranted, and practice making a different judgment under the same conditions until the new judgment begins to run faster than the old one. This is not quick. It is not comfortable. And it involves a particular kind of failure that most people find deeply discouraging, the experience of understanding exactly what you should do, choosing to try it, and then watching yourself fail anyway, because the conditioned response still moves faster than the examined one. But here is what changes the meaning of that failure entirely. The Stoics treated the noticing of the failure as itself a form of progress. Before the practice, you failed and did not notice the mechanism. After the practice begins, you fail and you see it happening in something closer to real time. Then you fail and you catch it slightly faster. Then faster still. The gap between impression and assent, which at first you could only observe in retrospect, gradually becomes accessible in the present moment. And eventually, in some situations, you find you can locate it before the reactive behavior has fully formed, and make a choice. That progression is the trajectory the Stoics were describing. Not a single transformation, but a slow, non-linear, repeatedly interrupted movement toward a greater range of choice in a greater range of circumstances. The fallout of understanding this is that the standard for evaluating yourself changes completely. You stop asking whether you were destabilized. That will happen. The question becomes, how quickly did you notice? How clearly did you see the mechanism? How close did you come to making a different choice? And over time, is the answer to those questions improving? Marcus asked himself these questions nightly. This is not speculation, it is what the meditations are. They are the record of a man conducting a daily audit of his own inner life, noting where the practice held and where it did not, recommitting to the direction without catastrophizing about the failures, and doing it again tomorrow. Not because he expected to arrive at a state of permanent equanimity, but because the daily practice itself was the good life, not a means to it. Seneca made the same point in a letter that is worth sitting with carefully. He wrote that he reviewed his entire day each evening, asking where he had gone wrong, where he had fallen short, where he could have acted better, not with the purpose of self-punishment, with the purpose of teaching himself. The evening review was not a verdict. It was a lesson plan for the following day. And now something shifts in the picture that makes all of this considerably harder. Because up to this point, the conversation has been largely internal. You, your impressions, your assent, your practice. But Stoicism was never only a private practice. And the moment you begin to live it visibly, to actually move differently through situations that would previously have destabilized you, you create an effect on the people around you that the philosophy did not fully prepare for. Some people find it grounding. They feel safer in your presence because your stability is not conditional on everything going well. Your calm is not performance. It is not indifference. It is a genuine quality of attention that does not amplify their anxiety with its own. But some people find it threatening. And the reason is precise. When you stop requiring someone's approval as a condition of your stability, you also stop being easily managed by its withdrawal. And for people who have organized their relationships around the power to grant or withhold validation, a person who genuinely does not need it represents something more than an anomaly. It represents the dissolution of a particular kind of leverage. And that dissolution does not go unchallenged. The countermove, when it comes, rarely looks like what it is. It almost never arrives as open hostility. It arrives as concern, as disappointment, as a subtle but persistent pressure that something has changed, that you are not as you were, that the version of you who needed reassurance and could be guided by its strategic withdrawal was somehow more authentic, more loving, more present than the version that no longer requires it. This is one of the most precise and least discussed consequences of Stoic practice when it begins to take actual hold, and it needs to be named clearly, because if you encounter it without preparation, it is genuinely disorienting. Because the pressure does not feel like manipulation. It feels like the relationship itself registering a loss, and you, trained now to take your inner states seriously and to examine them honestly, will find a part of yourself wondering whether the practice has made you cold, whether sovereignty is just another word for unavailability, whether what you have built is a citadel or a prison you have mistaken for freedom. This is the countermove that the Stoics anticipated and took seriously. Not external criticism of the philosophy, which they addressed at length, but the internal doubt that arises when the practice begins working, and when its effects produce friction with people whose relationship to you was structured around a version of you that has started to change. Epictetus addressed this directly in the context of family relationships, which in the ancient world carried an even more totalizing weight than they do today. A student asked him how to deal with a father who disapproved of his philosophical practice. Epictetus's response was not to dismiss the father's feelings or to recommend the student ignore the relationship. He said, "Bring your best philosophical reasoning to the relationship. Fulfill your role as a son with genuine care and attention. Do not treat the practice as a reason to withdraw from your obligations, but also do not treat your father's approval as the measure of whether the practice is correct, because if you do, you have made the practice itself conditional on external validation, and a practice that requires validation from the very force it is supposed to help you navigate is no practice at all. This creates a very specific trade-off that is worth examining carefully, because the Stoic practitioner who begins to find genuine inner stability will also, in many cases, find that some of their existing relationships were built on a particular kind of neediness that both parties had come to rely on. The relationship organized around mutual consolation, around the implicit agreement that each person's anxiety would be soothed by the other's attention, can feel threatened when one party begins to source their stability from somewhere other than the exchange. And the threatened party's response, the attempt to re-establish the old dynamic, to pull the practitioner back into familiar patterns of reactivity and need, is a countermove that deserves to be understood with compassion rather than contempt, because the person making it is not wrong that something has changed. They are simply misidentifying what the change costs them. What it costs them is not the relationship. What it costs them is a particular structure of control that the relationship had afforded. And that distinction, clearly seen, makes an enormous difference in how you respond. Marcus wrote at length about the people around him who pushed back against his equanimity. Courtiers who preferred a more predictable emperor, one whose moods could be read and whose reactions could be anticipated and managed. Generals who found his insistence on deliberation frustrating when their preferred approach was rapid and overwhelming response. Even family members who would have preferred less philosophy and more conventional imperial emotion. He observed their resistance without contempt and without capitulation. He tried to understand the legitimate concerns embedded in their opposition while not allowing those concerns to determine his choices. What he discovered, and what the historical record broadly supports, is that genuine stability in a position of authority is profoundly disorienting to people who have learned to navigate power by reading and exploiting emotional volatility. When the volatility is no longer reliably present, when the person at the center of the system cannot be predictably reached through flattery or provoked through criticism, the entire ecosystem of manipulation that had grown up around the volatility has to reorganize. And that reorganization is uncomfortable for everyone inside it. This is the wider consequence that the initial framework of individual practice did not fully anticipate. The practice does not exist in a sealed container. When one person changes, the relational system they inhabit must respond, and that response is frequently experienced by the practitioner as pressure to revert, as evidence that the change is causing harm, as a reason to question whether sovereignty was ever the right goal. Seneca encountered this in its most extreme form. As his philosophical commitments deepened, as he wrote with increasing clarity about the irrelevance of external fortune and the primacy of virtue, his position at Nero's court became increasingly untenable. Not simply because Nero was becoming dangerous, though he was, but because the life Seneca was arguing for philosophically, and the life he was actually living, had diverged to the point where maintaining both required an extraordinary amount of internal management. He eventually tried to withdraw from court life. He asked Nero's permission to retire, to give back much of the wealth he had accumulated, to spend his remaining years in philosophical study and writing. Nero refused. The refusal was itself a countermove. Seneca had become, through his long proximity to power, a symbol of a kind of moral legitimacy that Nero's court needed to display, even if Nero himself had no interest in its content. Seneca's visible presence lent a philosophical respectability to an administration that was becoming increasingly difficult to respect. His withdrawal would have removed that cover. So the cover was required to stay. This put Seneca in a position that tested the philosophy at its deepest level, not the position of someone practicing equanimity in relatively benign circumstances, but the position of someone trying to maintain inner sovereignty while embedded in a system whose continued operation required their participation and whose leader was capable of ending their life on a whim. His letters from this period have a quality of urgency that his earlier work lacks. He wrote about death with increasing directness. He wrote about the importance of living each day as though it might be the last, not as a motivational abstraction, but as a practical reality he was navigating daily. He also wrote something that goes to the heart of the wider consequences question. He observed that the person who has genuinely internalized Stoic practice, who has actually worked to locate their stability in virtue rather than in external conditions, faces a final paradox that cannot be philosophized away. The practice makes you better at living, and being better at living makes you more conscious of how much of your available life has already been spent in preparation for living rather than in the thing itself. This is not a comfortable observation. It carries a weight that accumulates as the practice deepens. You begin to see with increasing clarity the specific ways that the years before serious self-examination were organized around the management of impressions rather than genuine engagement with life. The energy spent seeking approval that was never truly satisfying. The time consumed by resentments that were never worth the cost of carrying them. The relationships maintained out of fear rather than genuine affinity. The choices made to avoid discomfort rather than to move toward what actually mattered. And you cannot go back and recover that time. The Stoics were unflinching about this. Seneca's essay on the shortness of life is the most direct treatment of it, and it is worth engaging with seriously because it changes the meaning of everything else in the philosophy. He argues that life is not actually short. It is sufficient, if used well. But most people do not use it well. They give the best hours of their attention to things that do not deserve it. They postpone living until conditions are more favorable, which is to say they postpone it indefinitely. They spend their mental energy managing the impressions of people whose opinions will be forgotten within a generation, at the cost of the inner work that would have made the time genuinely worth having. And then, at the end, they feel cheated. They feel that life was too brief. But Seneca's argument is that the feeling of briefness is not caused by the actual duration. It is caused by the proportion of the duration that was genuinely inhabited. If you have lived reactively, if you have handed your inner life over to whatever external force was loudest, then even a very long life will feel thin. Because most of it was not lived by you. It was lived by the accumulated impressions to which you gave unexamined assent. This is the widest consequence of the Stoic framework. It is not just that you can learn to be less bothered by specific provocations. It is that the same mechanism that makes you reactive to specific provocations is the mechanism that is consuming your life. Every moment of unexamined assent is a moment you are not actually present. Every time someone or something reaches you without your consent, without passing through the gap of examined judgment, a portion of your actual experience is being authored by something other than yourself. The scale of this, when you truly let it land, is staggering, because it means the question of whether nothing and no one can get to you is not a question about emotional comfort or social confidence. It is a question about how much of your own life you are actually living. The Stoics saw this, clearly, completely, and they drew a consequence from it that their critics have always found extreme, and that their most serious practitioners have always found undeniable. There is no neutral position. Every moment, you are either practicing examined judgment or you are practicing unexamined reaction. Every day, you are either building the capacity to be genuinely present to your own life or you are eroding it. The practice is not optional in the sense that any serious engagement with what it means to live well makes it unavoidable. The only question is whether you do it deliberately or whether it happens to you. And that question, once it has been seen clearly, does not stay comfortable for very long, because it forces a reckoning with something that is both more demanding and more liberating than anything the surface reading of the philosophy had suggested. The reckoning with what you have actually been doing with your attention and with what it would mean to genuinely change it. That reckoning, when it arrives, honestly, tends to reveal something that the philosophy had been circling from the beginning, but had not yet stated in its most confrontational form. The thing that has been getting to you, the force that has repeatedly breached your center, the person or circumstance or pattern that keeps reasserting its power over your inner state, it has not been doing this to you. You have been doing it with it. And the difference between those two descriptions is the difference between a life organized around defense and a life organized around construction. This is not a comfortable reframing. It is, in fact, the worst turn in the Stoic picture of the human situation, because it means the problem is not out there. It has never been out there. The thing you were waiting for the world to stop doing, the behavior you were hoping people would eventually change, the circumstances you were expecting to finally stabilize so that your inner life could settle, none of that was ever the actual obstruction. The obstruction was the waiting itself. The belief that your inner sovereignty was contingent on external conditions meeting some threshold before it could be practiced. Epictetus, with characteristic lack of softening, put it this way: the chains of some people are made of gold, and the person who cannot see that their chains are gold, who experiences their particular form of comfortable dependency as freedom, is in a worse position than the person whose chains are obviously iron. Because at least the person in iron chains knows they are bound. The person in gold chains is not only bound, but has organized their entire self-concept around calling the chains jewelry. That image cuts deeply, and it cuts precisely because it describes something recognizable, the dependency on a particular person's opinion that you have been calling deep love, the need for a specific kind of recognition that you have been calling high standards, the compulsive monitoring of how you are perceived that you have been calling self-awareness. These are the gold chains, and naming them is not self-blame. It is the precondition for putting them down. Now consider what happens when you place the three major figures of this story in direct confrontation with this realization, because each of them encountered it from a completely different angle, and each of their responses reveals something different and irreducibly important about what the reckoning actually requires. Epictetus encountered it through loss so total that the gold chain critique could not land with full force, because he had never been allowed to accumulate gold chains in the first place. What he was forced to confront instead was the subtler version, the chains made of necessity, the dependency not on luxury or approval, but on the bare conditions of physical existence, the body that could be hurt, the life that could be ended. And his response to that confrontation was the most philosophically radical of the three. He decided that even those conditions were externals, that even the continued functioning of the body was a preferred indifferent, that the only thing that could not be taken, under any circumstances, including the worst, was the quality of his own judgment in meeting what came. He called this the freedom that no one can take. and he lived it, as far as the historical record can determine, with a consistency that his students found both inspiring and somewhat frightening. Marcus encountered the reckoning through power, through the discovery that having everything the world could offer did not produce what the world had promised it would produce. He had authority, and the exercise of authority over others did not settle his inner life. He had wealth, and wealth did not resolve the question of meaning. He had the admiration of millions, and admiration did not answer the private inquiry he conducted every night in his journal. What he found, through the practice and through the honest record of the practice, was that none of the externals had ever been the answer, because none of them had ever been the right question. The right question was always internal, always about the quality of the next judgment, the next choice, the next response. The empire was not the answer. The meditations were the evidence that he knew it. Seneca encountered it through the most dramatic circumstances of the three, because for Seneca, the worst turn was not philosophical. It was literal. In 65 C, Nero accused him of involvement in the Pisonian conspiracy, a plot against the emperor's life. Scholars continue to debate whether Seneca was genuinely involved. The historical evidence is inconclusive. What is not in dispute is that he was ordered to take his own life. And what he did in those final hours was, in a specific and documented sense, the test of everything he had written. He attempted to open his veins. The process was slow, because he was elderly and his circulation was poor. He asked his scribes to continue taking dictation while he bled. He reportedly spoke to his friends and students who were present with the same calm that he had described in his letters as the goal of philosophical practice. Tacitus, who recorded the scene in the Annals, described it with visible respect for the consistency between Seneca's teaching and his death. He did not die performing Stoicism. He died living it. Whatever the full truth of his political situation, the final act was not theater. It was verification. And that verification changes the stakes of everything that came before it, because it means the philosophy was not a set of ideas that these men argued for in comfortable circumstances and then abandoned when things became genuinely serious. It was a set of capacities they built through daily practice and then deployed when the final test arrived. The test that no philosophy can help you pass unless you have already done the work that makes the passing possible. This is the point where the worst turn and the deepest clarification become the same thing. Because the revelation is not that the philosophy failed its practitioners under pressure. The revelation is that the practice, which looked from the outside like a matter of managing daily irritations and maintaining equanimity in ordinary circumstances, was actually preparation for something much larger. Every morning review, every evening audit, every deliberate insertion of the gap between impression and assent, every refusal to give unexamined assent to the most powerful impressions, was building something, a structure, an actual, functional inner architecture that could hold under conditions that destroyed people who had not built it. And this reveals something about the nature of the practice that changes how you understand what you are doing when you begin it. You are not trying to feel better in the moment. You are not trying to manage your mood or improve your social performance or become less sensitive to criticism. You are building, through the accumulated small acts of examined judgment, a self that is increasingly capable of meeting increasingly large challenges without being unmade by them. The daily practice is the construction of the infrastructure that the extraordinary moment will require, and the extraordinary moment does not announce itself in advance. Epictetus taught this through the image of training. He compared the philosophical student to an athlete who trains the body not for the specific competition they know is coming, but for the generic demand of physical excellence that competition will make. The athlete does not know exactly what the race will require. They train anyway. They build the capacity and trust that when the race arrives, the capacity will be there. The Stoic practitioner trains the mind in the same way. You do not know exactly what the worst day of your life will ask of you. You build the practice anyway. And when the day comes, if you have built it honestly and consistently, you will find that you have resources you did not know you had. Marcus found this repeatedly. The Antonine Plague, which devastated the Roman Empire beginning around 165 C and continued for years, killed millions of people and strained every institution of the empire. Marcus governed through it. He made decisions about resource allocation, about the treatment of the sick, about the conduct of military campaigns in the face of enormous casualties, about the succession of power in circumstances where his own death was a genuine daily possibility. The meditations from this period have a quality of practice steadiness that is different from the earlier entries, not because the circumstances were less severe, because the practice had been running longer. The infrastructure was more robust. The gap between impression and assent had widened through years of daily exercise to the point where even the most overwhelming impressions could be met with something resembling clarity. This is the progression the Stoics were describing, and it brings into focus the single, most important, and most consistently misunderstood element of the entire philosophy. The goal is not indifference. The goal is not the elimination of caring. The goal is not a state of pleasant numbness where nothing reaches you, because nothing matters. The goal is what the Stoics called apatheia, which looks like apathy in translation, but means something profoundly different. It means freedom from the path, the pathological passions, the distorted emotional states that arise from giving unexamined assent to false impressions. Fear of things that are not actually dangerous, desire for things that are not actually necessary, grief that goes beyond its appropriate expression and becomes a permanent distortion of perception, anger that loses its connection to justice and becomes simply the habit of being inflamed. Freedom from those is not the same as freedom from emotion. It is the condition under which genuine emotion, clear emotion, emotion that arises from accurate perception rather than from distorted impression, becomes possible for the first time. The person who has never examined their impressions is not more emotional than the Stoic. They are more reactive. And reactivity is not depth. It is noise. The person who has built genuine equanimity, who has done the work of examining their impressions until the unexamined ones stop running the show, does not love less. They love more accurately. They do not care less. They care about the right things with the right intensity. They are not less present to suffering, their own or others. They are more present, because they are not managing the suffering through distortion and avoidance. They are meeting it directly, with whatever clarity the practice has given them to bring. And this is the point from which the payoff becomes possible. Because if the practice produces not coldness, but clarity, not detachment, but depth, then the question of how to ensure that nothing and no one can get to you has an answer that is completely different from the defensive answer the question seemed to promise. The answer is not a wall. It is a foundation. A foundation. Let that distinction settle for a moment, because it changes the entire architecture of what you have been building toward. A wall is defensive. It requires constant maintenance. It has to be extended as new threats emerge from new directions. It costs energy to sustain. And it has a fundamental strategic weakness. It makes you a target. When you are visibly defended, when the armor is showing, people who want to reach you simply look for the gap. And there is always a gap, because a wall is built against specific threats you can anticipate, and the world is creative in producing threats you cannot. A foundation is different in every way that matters. It does not present itself as a defense. It simply is. The person who has built a genuine inner foundation is not resisting the world's attempts to destabilize them. They are simply not organized in the way that destabilization requires. The manipulation that requires your neediness to function finds no neediness to operate on. The criticism that requires your self-doubt to land finds no self-doubt accepting delivery. The withdrawal that requires your anxiety about abandonment to create leverage finds no such anxiety available. Not because those things have been suppressed or armored over, because through sustained practice they have been genuinely addressed at their root. This is the outcome that the practice produces when it has had time to work, and it is worth being specific about what that outcome actually looks like in a life, because the abstract description does not fully capture what changes. The first thing that changes is the speed of recovery. Before serious practice, being destabilized is an event. It happens, and it takes time to return from. Hours, sometimes days. The reactive state lingers, coloring subsequent perception, generating secondary reactions to the original reaction, producing the familiar experience of being stuck in a loop that you cannot seem to exit. After sustained practice, the duration of destabilization contracts. Not because you are suppressing the initial response, which, as Seneca noted, is not entirely within your control anyway, but because the examination begins sooner, the gap opens faster, and the return to stability happens before the reactive state has had time to fully consolidate and generalize. Marcus recorded this in the Meditations in a way that is easy to miss if you are reading for content rather than for process. He often described his morning as beginning with the anticipation of difficulty. He expected to encounter difficult people, frustrating circumstances, situations that would demand more than he felt ready to give. And then he described returning to equanimity not after the day was over but within the encounter itself. The gap was not something he accessed in retrospect. He was, after years of practice, beginning to access it in real time, in the middle of the situation, without withdrawing from engagement. That is the goal. Not to become someone who responds calmly after a period of calm reflection in a protected environment, but to become someone who can find the examined response within the pressure of the actual moment. In the conversation, in the confrontation, in the situation where everything in your nervous system is saying that the threat is real and the stakes are high, and there is no time for philosophical deliberation. The Stoics knew this level of capacity required years of building. They were not selling a quick method. They were describing a life practice. And they were careful to distinguish between the person who had understood the framework, who could articulate the principles fluently, and the person who had built the actual capacity, whose behavior under pressure demonstrated that the understanding had moved from the theoretical level into the operational level. The practical consequence of this distinction is enormously important and is where most people who encounter Stoicism in a casual or motivational context get stuck. You can read the philosophy and feel genuinely moved by it. You can nod along with the idea that external events do not have inherent power over your inner state. You can experience a genuine sense of clarity in the reading that feels like a change in your relationship to the world. And then encounter the next person who knows exactly how to push your buttons and find yourself reacting in the same pattern as always, feeling guilty about the reaction because you know better, which adds a layer of philosophical self-criticism on top of the original reactivity. This experience, which is extremely common, is not evidence that the philosophy does not work. It is evidence that understanding and capacity are different things, and the response the Stoics prescribed was not frustration with the gap, but use of it. Every moment of reactive failure, seen clearly rather than judged harshly, is precise information about where the practice needs to go next. The failure is not the opposite of the practice, it is the material of it. Epictetus was direct about this with his students in a way that could be mistaken for harsh, but was actually a form of respect. He refused to treat their failures as evidence of incapacity. He treated them as evidence of incomplete practice. The distinction matters because incapacity is fixed and practice is not. You are not someone who cannot change. You are someone who has not yet changed enough, and the distance between those two descriptions is entirely traversable, but only in one direction, and only by doing the work. Now here is where the resolution of the central promise begins to come into focus. The hook at the beginning of this documentary promised something specific, the secret to making sure nothing and no one can ever get to you again. And that promise needs to be met honestly. Because there is a version of the answer that is easy and false, and a version that is harder and true. The easy and false version says, follow these steps and you will become impervious. Nothing will affect you. No one will be able to hurt you. You will exist in a permanent state of equanimity that makes all external difficulty irrelevant. This version is appealing, and it is a lie. The Stoics themselves were explicit about this. They did not promise immunity from the first movement of emotion. They did not promise that loss would not hurt, or that betrayal would not sting, or that the deaths of people you love would not grieve you. They promised something different and something real. They promised that the hurt would not own you, that the sting would not become the whole story, that the grief would be felt and honored and eventually integrated rather than becoming a permanent organizing principle of your inner life. They promised that between what the world does to you and what you do with it, there is a space that belongs to you. That the space can be widened. That widening it is the central work of a serious life, and that a person who has done that work becomes, in a very practical sense, unreachable in the way that actually matters. Not unreachable meaning nothing arrives, but unreachable meaning nothing arrives and takes up permanent residence without your invitation. There is a specific Stoic practice that serves as the most direct implementation of this resolution, and it is one that Marcus used with notable consistency. He called it the view from above. The practice involves deliberately shifting your perspective from the immediate situation, with all its emotional charge and apparent urgency, to a wider view. Not escaping the situation, but placing it in a context large enough that its actual proportions become visible. The criticism from the colleague becomes, in the wider view, one person's assessment on one day, in the context of a life that contains vastly more than that assessment can evaluate. The argument with a partner becomes, in the wider view, one moment of friction in a relationship that contains years of shared experience. The professional failure becomes, in the wider view, one chapter in a story whose later chapters have not yet been written. This is not denial. It is not minimizing. It is accurate perception, corrected for the distortion that emotional urgency naturally produces. Because emotional urgency, the feeling of immediate crisis that accompanies being destabilized, genuinely narrows perception. It makes the current moment feel more permanent and more defining than it actually is. The view from above does not say the moment does not matter. It says the moment is not the whole story, and that correction, accurately made, changes the emotional weight of the moment without falsifying it. Marcus applied this to the most extreme circumstances. In the meditations he described looking back across history and observing how many individuals who had seemed enormously powerful and significant in their own time had been completely forgotten within a few generations, not as a reason for nihilism or despair, as a corrective to the inflation of stakes that the present moment always produces. He was not saying nothing matters because everything ends. He was saying that the thing currently consuming your inner life may be considerably smaller than it presently feels, and that seeing it in proportion is a form of practical wisdom rather than indifference. The application to the question of being reached by others is direct and precise. When someone's opinion of you is currently consuming significant portions of your inner life, the view from above asks, in the actual span of your life, and the full context of who you are and what you have built and what you are building, how much of that span is this one person's assessment entitled to occupy? And the answer, in most cases, is considerably less than it is currently being given, not zero, but not the totalizing weight that unexamined assent has allowed it to accumulate. This is the practice applied to the specific problem of being gotten to, and it works by targeting the mechanism at its source. The reason someone's opinion carries weight is that somewhere, usually without examination, you have made a judgment that their assessment is authoritative regarding something you care about. You have decided or absorbed from your history the decision that their view of your worth or your competence or your lovability is either evidence or counter-evidence for the actual truth about you, and that silent decision, never examined, is doing all the work. It is the reason the comment lands with force. It is the reason withdrawal feels like threat. It is the reason the criticism recycles through your thinking for hours or days, rather than passing through as information and releasing. The Stoic examination does not say the opinion is irrelevant. It asks whether the judgment you made about the opinion's authority is accurate, and in most cases, when examined honestly, it is not. The authority you have assigned to this voice was assigned by you, often very early in your life, often under conditions that had everything to do with your vulnerability at the time, and very little to do with whether the voice actually possesses the wisdom its assigned authority implies. This realization is simultaneously liberating and disorienting. It is liberating because it means the authority can be examined and, where unwarranted, withdrawn. It is disorienting because withdrawing it requires revising a self-concept that may have been organized around that authority for a very long time. If you have spent years organizing your choices around what a particular person thinks of you, then examining the warrant for that authority is not a small adjustment. It is a restructuring of how you know who you are. The Stoics were honest about the size of that restructuring. They called the process of genuinely examining and revising your core judgments a philosophical conversion, a turning of the whole person, not a shift in opinion, a reorientation of the faculty that forms opinions. And they said it took time, it took consistent practice, and it took the specific kind of honesty about your own failures that most people spend their lives avoiding because it is genuinely uncomfortable to see with that clarity. But they also said it was the only thing that actually worked. Every other strategy for not being gotten to, for protecting yourself from destabilization, is partial at best. Avoidance works until the situation you were avoiding finds you anyway. Desensitization works for specific triggers but does not address the underlying mechanism that will simply find new triggers. Social skill works until you encounter someone who does not respond to your social skill. Confidence, in the conventional sense of positive self-regard, works until something happens that challenges the basis of the confidence. Only the actual construction of the inner foundation addresses the problem at its root. Because the foundation does not depend on external circumstances remaining favorable. It does not require the world to cooperate. It does not require the people around you to stop being who they are. It exists independent of all of that, because it is built from the inside, and the building materials are entirely internal. And here is the consequence that follows from this resolution that closes one of the major loops the documentary opened. The question of whether you can become unreachable is not primarily a question about other people. It is a question about how thoroughly you have examined and revised the judgments that have been giving other people their power over you. The person who gets to you has never been the source of the problem. They have been the diagnostic. They have been the instrument by which you could identify exactly where your unexamined ascent was still operating. And once you see that, their role in your life changes fundamentally. They become less threatening and more useful. Not because you no longer care about how they treat you, but because you no longer need them to treat you a particular way in order to maintain your center. This is the first complete resolution. But it is not the final one, because there is a dimension of the Stoic answer that has not yet been fully addressed, and it is the dimension that changes not just your relationship to people who challenge you, but your relationship to time itself. To the question of what you do with the life that the practice is, day by day, incrementally freeing up from the management of unexamined reactions. The Stoics had a great deal to say about that, and what they said is the most surprising part of the entire picture. What the Stoics said about time is the part of the philosophy that most people who encounter it in popular form never reach. Because the popular version is largely organized around emotional management, around resilience, around not being destroyed by what happens to you, and those are real and valuable applications of the framework. But they are not the full picture. They are, in fact, the preparation for something that the Stoics considered considerably more important. The Stoics said that when you are no longer spending the majority of your inner resources managing unexamined reactions, something becomes available that was not available before. Not leisure, not comfort, not the quiet enjoyment of having solved the problem of suffering. What becomes available is full presence to the actual content of your life. And that presence, they argued, is the thing that most human beings are never able to access, because the management of anxiety and reactivity and the endless administration of their social image is consuming everything. Seneca made this argument with a force that still carries. He wrote that the person who has genuinely worked on their inner life does not have more time than anyone else. But they have more of their time. Because the hours that other people spend in the passive suffering of unexamined emotion, in the rehearsal of grievances, in the management of impressions, in the anxious scanning for signs of approval or disapproval, those hours are reclaimed. Not dramatically, not all at once. Incrementally, as the practice deepens and the unexamined reactions that were consuming them begin to dissolve. And what you do with those reclaimed hours is, for the Stoics, the actual point of the whole enterprise. Because the purpose of freeing yourself from reactivity is not to achieve a pleasant inner quietness. It is to direct your full attention toward what actually matters, toward the relationships you have chosen rather than the ones you are managing, toward the work that expresses your genuine capacities rather than the work you are doing to prove yourself to an audience, toward the questions that your real curiosity generates rather than the performances your anxiety requires. This is where the Stoic account of the good life connects to what Marcus called the contemplative life, by which he did not mean withdrawal from action, but action that arises from a genuinely examined source. Not the frantic action of a person trying to outrun their own anxiety, not the compulsive productivity of someone who cannot stop, because stopping would mean having to sit with thoughts they have not examined, but the deliberate, chosen, freely given action of someone who has located their own ground and can move from it without being pulled off it by every external force that pushes. There is a practical consequence of this that bears naming directly, because it changes the stakes of the practice from individual psychological management to something considerably larger. The person who has done genuine inner work is a different kind of presence in the lives of the people around them, not because they have become wiser in some abstract sense, though that too, but because they have stopped using other people as instruments for managing their own inner states. They are no longer seeking validation from their friends and partners and children and colleagues, which means those relationships are no longer burdened with the weight of that unspoken demand. They can listen without needing the conversation to affirm them. They can help without needing the help to be recognized. They can love without needing the love to be returned in a specific form as a condition of continuing to give it. This is the Stoic vision of what a genuinely free person looks like in relationship. And it is, paradoxically, the most socially generous version of a human being imaginable, because the person who needs nothing from you in order to maintain their own stability can offer you their full presence without the transaction that neediness always implies. They can be with you in your difficulty without making your difficulty about their difficulty. They can support you without competing for the position of the person who needs more support. They can stay calm in your crisis without the calm being a performance of superiority. It is simply what they have built, and they bring it with them, and it is available to you without a price. Marcus described this quality in the people he most admired, in the Meditations, with a specificity that makes the description concrete rather than idealized. He described his adoptive father, Antoninus Pius, as someone whose equanimity was not a performance and not an achievement that required visible effort. It had become, through long practice, simply the way he was. His stability was not the stability of someone suppressing their reactions. It was the stability of someone whose reactions had been genuinely educated over a lifetime of deliberate practice, until the educated response ran faster and more naturally than the old reactive one. That description is significant because it tells you where the practice eventually leads if you stay with it long enough. Not to a state of effortful control where you are constantly monitoring your impressions and wrestling with your assent, but to a state where the examined response has become more habitual than the unexamined one, where the gap between impression and considered response has been trained until it functions more quickly and more reliably than the old automatic reaction, where what looks from the outside like natural equanimity is the product, from the inside, of years of daily construction. The Stoics called this second nature. The first nature, the reactive, impression-driven, automatic set of responses you were born with and conditioned into, is what you begin with. The second nature, the examined, virtuous, deliberate set of responses you build through practice, is what you can become. And the distance between those two natures is traversed not by a single conversion experience, but by the accumulation of thousands of small acts of examined judgment, each one contributing something to the structure, each one moving the needle slightly in the direction of the person you are building. Now here is the final surprising detail, the one that reframes everything that has come before in a way that neither the popular account of Stoicism nor the academic account fully captures. When Marcus Aurelius died in 180 C, in the military camp near modern Vienna, far from Rome, during one of the last campaigns of his reign, the Meditations were not published. They were not found among state documents or official records. They were private notes, never intended for an audience. The most complete account of how one of the most powerful human beings in recorded history actually practiced the philosophy of inner sovereignty was written for an audience of exactly one. Himself, he did not write the Meditations to teach anyone. He wrote them to remember, to remind himself daily of the things he knew and kept forgetting, to catch his own failures before they became habits, to recommit, in the privacy of his own inner life, to the direction he had chosen. He was, by every measure available to us, one of the most philosophically serious practitioners of Stoicism who ever lived. And he needed to write the same reminders to himself, again and again, across what appears to have been the better part of 2 decades. That is the surprising detail, and here is why it changes the broader interpretation. The Meditations are often read as evidence of Marcus's spiritual achievement, as the product of a disciplined and cultivated mind that had reached unusual heights of inner clarity. And they are that. But they are also, and more importantly, evidence of something else entirely. They are evidence of how the practice actually works for a real human being in real circumstances, which is imperfectly, repeatedly, with constant backsliding and recommitment, with the same observations appearing over and over because the same failures kept appearing over and over, with genuine frustration visible beneath the philosophical equanimity, with the honest admission, made to himself in private because there was no one else to make it to, that the distance between knowing and embodying was still wide even after decades of effort. This is not a diminishment of Marcus. It is the most humanizing and practically useful truth the historical record of Stoicism contains, because it tells you that the person who represents perhaps the most sustained and serious practical engagement with this philosophy in recorded history was still, to the end of his life, in the middle of the practice, still finding that the impressions arrived with their usual force, still finding that the gap between impression and assent required active, deliberate effort to maintain, still needing to remind himself of things he had known for 20 years, and he did it anyway, every day, not because he was close to finishing, but because the practice itself was the point. The daily act of examining, of recommitting, of catching the failure and beginning again, that was not a means to some final state of achieved wisdom. That was the life. That was the whole thing. When you understand that, the promise of the hook resolves in a completely different way than you might have expected. The secret to ensuring that nothing and no one can ever get to you again is not a technique you apply once and then live from. It is not an insight that, once fully grasped, permanently changes your relationship to external pressure. It is a practice, a daily, ongoing, never-finished practice of examining your own impressions before giving them the authority they are asking for, of widening the gap between what arrives and how you respond, of building, incrementally and without fanfare, the inner foundation that determines whether other people and external circumstances have access to your center. The reason nothing and no one can get to you is not that you become invulnerable. It is that you become the active, daily author of your own inner state rather than its passive recipient. And active authorship means that when something does reach you, as things will always reach you, because you are human and the world is real and contact is unavoidable, you meet it as the author rather than as the page. You meet it with a practiced capacity to examine it, to assign it its accurate weight, to respond from your chosen values rather than your triggered reflexes, and to return to your foundation without drama and without prolonged displacement. That capacity, built through exactly the kind of daily practice that Marcus recorded and Epictetus demanded and Seneca described and enacted, is what unreachability actually means. Not the absence of impact, the presence of examined response, not immunity from being affected, sovereignty over what the effect produces. And the legacy of this understanding is the reason a philosophy developed in ancient Greece and Rome and practiced seriously by a slave, an emperor, and an advisor to a tyrant is still in circulation more than 2,000 years later, still being read by people who have never studied classical philosophy, still producing the recognition that the thing you were looking for was already inside the only domain that has ever been genuinely yours. There are very few ideas in the history of human thought that have proven this durable. Most philosophies rise and fall with the cultural conditions that produce them. The Stoics endure because the problem they were addressing is not cultural. It is not historical. It is structural. As long as there are human beings who have the capacity to receive impressions and give them assent, the question of whether that assent is examined or automatic, and the consequences of the answer for the quality of a human life, will be exactly as relevant as it was when Zeno walked out of that Athens bookshop and decided to spend his life thinking about what it meant to be truly free. The practice does not ask you to become someone different. It asks you to become more fully the author of who you already are, to reclaim, through daily effort and honest examination, the territory of your own inner life that has been occupied by unexamined habits, inherited judgments, and the accumulated weight of giving other people's opinions a power they were never entitled to exercise. That reclamation is not a destination. It is what happens every morning when you begin again, every time you catch an impression before it runs unchecked, every time you find the gap and make a choice, every time you return to the practice after failing at it, without using the failure as evidence against the practice or against yourself. It is what Marcus was doing in his tent at the edge of empire, writing to himself in the dark about things he already knew. And it is what is available to you, starting from exactly where you are, with exactly the day that is arriving tomorrow. What does it mean that this is what survived? Not the administrative records of Marcus's reign, not the military dispatches, not the formal philosophical treatises he might have written for public consumption. What survived, almost by accident, copied and recopied through medieval monasteries by people who may not have fully understood what they were preserving, was a private journal of failure and recommitment, the most intimate record we have of how a serious mind actually lives with a serious philosophy, not as an achievement but as a practice, not as a conclusion but as a direction. The survival of the meditations is itself a kind of argument. History preserved the document that was never meant to be preserved, while countless texts written for immortality have been lost completely. And what that document contains, beneath the philosophical content, beneath the Stoic principles and the reminders and the self-corrections, is something that no one who reads it carefully can miss. It contains evidence that the practice does not eliminate the struggle. It transforms your relationship to it. That is the legacy. Not the promise of a life without friction, without being affected, without the ordinary human experience of being reached by the world, but the building of a relationship to that experience that is genuinely different from the one most people carry without examining. The difference between a life where things happen to you and a life where things happen, and you are present to them as the author of your response. The unresolved tension that this legacy leaves is the same tension Zeno created when he walked into that bookshop in Athens. The gap between the ideal and the lived reality, between the sage the philosophy describes and the progress maker the philosophy actually produces. That gap is not a failure of the philosophy. It is the space where all genuine practice lives. And the fact that it has never been fully closed, not by Epictetus, not by Marcus, not by Seneca, not by any of the centuries of practitioners who have followed them, is not disqualifying. It is, in a precise and important sense, the point. A practice that could be completed would only be as large as the version of yourself that began it. The practice the Stoics described is exactly as large as you are willing to let yourself become. It expands with you. It meets you where you are and calls you further. It does not promise arrival. It promises that the direction is worth holding. There is something in the modern encounter with this philosophy that the Stoics themselves could not have anticipated, and it is worth naming. We live in conditions of stimulation that would have been genuinely incomprehensible to anyone in the ancient world. The number of impressions the average person receives in a single day, the volume of other people's opinions, reactions, and judgments that arrive through a device we carry in our pocket and consult dozens of times a day, the constant availability of comparison and measurement and public evaluation, all of this has made the Stoic problem not smaller, but larger. Not easier, but harder. The gap between impression and assent that Epictetus was training his students to find has never been harder to locate, because the impressions arrive faster and in greater volume than any previous generation of human beings has had to navigate. And that makes the practice not less relevant. It makes it more urgent than it has ever been. Because the mechanism is unchanged, impressions still arrive, assent is still given, automatically, unless something intervenes. And the something that intervenes is still the same thing it always was, the deliberate, practiced, daily choice to examine what is arriving before deciding what it means and what authority it deserves. This is what the Stoics gave us. Not a solution to the problem of being human, but a framework for meeting the problem consciously, with clear eyes, without flinching from what honest self-examination reveals, and with the patience to build something real over time instead of waiting for a transformation that arrives without effort. The three men at the center of this story lived in different centuries, occupied incomparably different social positions, and faced incomparably different external pressures. What they shared was the discovery that the most important work a human being can do is internal, invisible, daily, and never fully complete. And what they left behind, in the discourses, in the meditations, in the letters, is the evidence that they actually did the work. Not perfectly, not finally, but honestly, with full acknowledgement of the distance between the ideal and the actual, and with the conviction that the direction was worth holding anyway. That evidence is still here, 2,000 years later, waiting to be read by people who are facing the same fundamental problem in different circumstances, with the same fundamental capacity to meet it, if they choose to build it. The practice begins wherever you are, not with the version of yourself you intend to become, with the version that is here right now, imperfect, conditioned, still handing over the key more often than you would like, still giving unexamined assent to impressions that deserve scrutiny. That version is the starting point. And the practice is simply what happens when that version decides, deliberately and without drama, to begin examining rather than assuming, to begin choosing rather than reacting, to begin building the foundation rather than waiting for the world to become less demanding. Nothing outside you will ever fully stop trying to reach you. The world does not make that accommodation. People will continue to be who they are. Events will continue to be what they are. The impressions will keep arriving with the same force and the same speed. What can change, through practice that feels like failure and builds something real anyway, is what you do when they arrive. And what you do when they arrive is the whole of the inner life, the whole of what is actually yours, the whole of what no circumstance and no person has ever been able to reach without your consent, even when it felt like they had. If this documentary moved something in you, if the ideas here feel like they have a claim on your attention, the most useful thing you can do is not to save it for later. Begin the examination now, not tomorrow, not when circumstances are more favorable. Now, because the Stoics were right about the shortness of time, and the practice that is postponed is the practice that does not happen. If you want to continue this conversation, if you want to go deeper into the ideas that make genuine inner sovereignty possible, Subscribe and stay close to this channel. There is more here, and it is waiting for you. Because the work of becoming the author of your own inner life is exactly as available as the next moment in which you choose to begin it, and there is no better time than this one.